Welcome to Your Strata Property, the podcast for property owners looking for reliable, accurate, and bite-sized information from an experienced and authoritative source. To access previous episodes and useful strata tips, go to www.yourstrataproperty.com.au.
Hello and welcome. I'm Amanda Farmer and this is Your Strata Property. Ruben Schwartz describes himself as an ex-journo, ex-scientist, ex-data guy, ex-writer, ex-consultant, ex-product manager, ex-delivery manager, and he says that he is currently the ex-co-founder of bnbguard.com.au. B&B Guard protects your building from short-term rentals, working with property managers, strata buildings, building managers and local councils to control the problem. Ruben is experienced in all aspects of digital product management, including development, strategy, UX, launch, customer growth, and rapid lean delivery. He has been involved in numerous early-stage startups as founder, advisor, coach, and employee. The industries he's been involved in span financial advice, superannuation, insurance, content marketing, news media, real estate and prop tech, IT consulting, caravans, edutech, and more. Today, I am delighted to welcome Ruben Schwartz of bnbguard.com.au. Hi, Ruben.
Hi, Amanda. Thanks for having me.
Absolute pleasure to have you here today. And Ruben, I think our names came up together in an article, I think it was a domain.com.au article, where we were both quoted on the topic, the very hot topic in New South Wales, if not around the world, of short-term rentals. And I thought I'd bring you onto the podcast to have a chat about exactly what B&B Guard is, what service you're providing, because it sounds pretty cool, and how our listeners might be able to make use of it. So I'll start by asking you, Ruben, why do you say that our strata buildings need protection from short-term rentals?
I think for most people, it comes down to them wanting a home, not a hotel. Mm-hmm. There are places out there already, apartment hotels, where you can get that kind of mix. But most people don't want that. They want an apartment they can live in. They want a community around them. They want neighbors. They don't want strangers coming and going every day. There's a lot of risks around short-term rentals too that other people in those strata communities unfairly wear. And those are the risks like having loud parties. Frequent complaint, most common complaint we get from short-term rentals is just the parties. We have this image of short-term rentals as being something that sort of mum and dads do for tourists who come from overseas kind of thing. But there's actually quite a lot of activity, which is just a bunch of teenagers or 20-somethings get a room and have a party. And if you've got 10, 20 people, it's very cheap to book a 4-bedroom house, or, what happens in Melbourne a lot. These teenagers rent an apartment and they can do it for about $10 each. And that's where you get a lot of these problems, because the hosts don't vet a short-term guest like you vet a long-term guest. Yeah. It's just there's not the time and obviously the resources to do that. So we don't really know. I live in a strata community as well. We don't really know who's coming and going in these buildings, and that poses risks. Those parties increase crime. There's lots of incidences of people who get access to strata buildings and copying the keys, copying the access fobs, which can be done for about $40-$50 if you know the right people, and then have complete access to that building after that. And if you look around downtown Sydney and downtown Melbourne, you see these lock boxes around attached to old bikes or trees or what have you. And it's relatively easy to figure out where those lock boxes actually, what building they belong to, even what unit they belong to, if you know what you're doing like we do. There's also financial worries, potentially increased insurance costs for having these the short-term rental activity, because obviously much higher risk than a long-term rental. More wear and tear, more fines from garbage infractions, parking infractions, those kinds of things. And there's sort of unsavory things that come along with them as well, which is there's something called a pop-up brothel, which is something not a lot of people know about, but it's something that happens a lot in short-term rentals because it makes economic sense, really.
Before we move on, I have to ask you, can you perhaps with some tact describe the pop-up brothel?
Sure. Well, it's a lot more common than we think, and a lot of our customers see it, although for obvious reasons they don't talk about it a lot. Yeah. And that is when a prostitute will rent out an Airbnb for the night and use it as his or her headquarters. And then you get their customers coming and going on that floor for that night. And then another night they open it somewhere else. It's a really cheap, easy way for them to do it.
Now, our long-term listeners will be well across many of those issues that you've helpfully outlined there, Ruben. Some listeners are dealing with short-term letting in their building, trying to find ways to regulate it. Others who have been very active in the policy making that's been going on here in New South Wales. What are you doing with B&B Guard? What is it? How does it help these buildings?
Sure. B&B Guard we have technology that monitors all the major short-term rental websites in Australia. That's sites like Airbnb, HomeAway, Booking.com, as well as some sites that you don't normally think about that way, like Flatmates.com. We find maybe 5 to 10% of our short-term rentals are actually on Flatmates, people taking over a lease, people who welcome backpackers in for a spare room, and well as smaller niche sites like MrBnB.com, which is an overseas gay-friendly site, which is quite popular in Sydney, especially around events like Mardi Gras. There are all kinds of smaller sites too, like Holiday Paws, which is pet-friendly, Kid & Co., which is a family-friendly site. So we're seeing a big kind of an explosion, and we'll see a lot more in years to come now that Airbnb has normalized the phenomenon of this short-term rental activity moving to those smaller niche sites where they've got a community of trust. So we monitor those websites, all the major ones. Our technology does this efficiently. We have some technology that sort of looks at the images, looks at the metadata around the building and around the listings, or does it have the same pool and a spa and that kind of thing. And then we have a final human layer, which does a check on whether that listing is a match to our customers' buildings. When it is, we notify our customers, and then we work with them to try to get that removed.
Okay, how do you get it removed?
That's the tricky part. So you don't talk to the platforms, because even if they'll do it, it'll take a long time, and then you have to have clear evidence of illegal activity. We find that about a third of the listings we find are by tenants, not by the owners, and those are always against the lease agreements, so those can be shut down right away. In New South Wales, it's until the new legislation comes in, it's still possible to have bylaws banning it, which a lot of our customers do. And so they pursue those avenues. But to be frank, the best way to do it is to have a proactive building manager, proactive strata manager, and for them to make life difficult and undermine the economic case for short-term rentals in the building and push that activity elsewhere.
Okay, a couple of things there. You do the monitoring, you do the identifying and matching your customer with the listing. Do you then continue to work with the customer as part of your service, working together with them through that process of trying to eliminate the short-term letting? Or do you sort of give them you let them know it's there and they're on their way to try and solve it themselves?
So at the moment, we're more in the second camp. We notify them and keep them notified if their listing comes back. We keep monitoring those listings, but we're moving into the first. We're trying to become more of a service that a building can sign up to, or an OC can sign up to, and then we'll help them navigate the often complex legal environment and come up with the kinds of policies that will push this activity out of their building or allow them to control it. Some buildings don't mind people who do it over Christmas, or people who do it every now and then, or rent out a spare room. It's the people who are renting out a whole property all year round and not caring who comes in, they want to crack down on. So we want to help the OCs control short-term rentals in the way that they see fit and help them navigate the laws and come up with the right policies to do that.
Yeah, I think you've got the right idea there, where it seems like we can't really rely on our legislators to give us some useful, perhaps, tools to deal with this problem, and the platforms themselves won't deal with it. You've said there earlier, it's no good approaching, say, the Airbnb platform to say, this listing is illegal, it's not permitted in our building, you need to remove it. They're simply going to ignore you. Or something that I just saw just within the last couple of days, I'm not sure if you're across it, Ruben, what's happening in Boston. I think Airbnb is taking the government there to court over their new laws, which are due to commence the 1st of January, I think. And I'm not quite across exactly what the laws are, but their argument is that Airbnb cannot remove what they call third-party material or third-party content from their website. So they're saying, well, the host has put the listing up. That listing belongs to the host. If you have laws, Boston, that tell us we need to take that down for whatever reason, we can't touch that. And that'll be really interesting to see that play out as to, what the courts there say about those kind of rules and third-party content?
It's kind of the dirty secret is probably too strong of a word, but the short-term rental industry is very much two industries that get mashed together, especially in lobbying efforts by the platforms and the interest groups. There is a short-term rental industry, which is mum and dads renting out a spare room, which is people who live in Coffs Harbour or Byron Bay doing what they've always done and renting out their place over Christmas, New Year's. And for the most part, we have customers who are councils as well, and we work with them to identify properties who aren't paying proper, who have a commercial operations but not paying proper levies. And they don't care about the stuff that's always been going on. And the same with the stratas. They don't really care about the people, the good actors who have been doing it all along, who are mom and pops. What they care about is the commercial operations. And from what the data we can see, the companies don't release the data, it seems like the bulk of the activity and the revenue actually comes from those professional investor listings, the full-time ones.
For sure, yeah.
And the reason I think potentially that there's been such a pushback in Boston is because Boston's come on really hard against the investor short-term rentals, basically banning them completely. And the Airbnb doesn't want that to set a precedent. The laws themselves, in terms of registration and licensing and things, kind of follow the best practice, what we've seen elsewhere.
Interesting. From what I've seen of your website and the commentary that you've got out there, you are across what's happening around the world and looking at the different approaches, whether it's a more hands-on and regulatory approach or less so. Perhaps I'm looking at a place like Victoria where they've got their relatively new laws. That's pretty laissez-faire, we may say, which is really helpful to have that body of knowledge, that documentation that you have, and of course, second to that, you've got the data. So your technology is going through these websites and you must have quite a mountain of useful data there building up.
We're definitely collecting a lot of really interesting data. What we're seeing in particular, like I said before, a lot of activity on those professional listings. We're a young company. We didn't start out doing data science, so we're still building that functionality or that capability. The other thing we're seeing is more and more listings on these smaller niche sites. And interestingly, more and more listings on the smaller sites that aren't on the bigger sites. We just had one launch earlier this year, which has only about 10 listings in Australia, called Naturist B&B, which is a nudist-friendly B&B, which is really, it's taken off overseas, and Australia will follow. But those listings, we can't find them on other sites. They're targeting specifically that market. And we see that more and more with Noir B&B, or Inclusive, which is an African-American friendly one, Mr. B&B. People realize that using the aggregator sites in particular, like tripping.com, where they just pick up listings from everywhere, you don't need to be on Airbnb. You can be on these smaller sites, which offer you often better rates and keep under the radar of the regulators. So we see ourselves as playing a pretty pivotal role in Australia, helping councils and helping stratas keep on top of this activity across multiple websites, because, as you said with Boston, you can't rely on the platforms themselves to play ball. Once they sense they're going to lose too much money, they're going to start looking at other revenues.
And they indeed have the money to spend fighting those battles and looking at those avenues.
In London, for example, Airbnb gets a lot of bad flack. They're actually one of the better players in the industry, potentially because they're under the spotlight as the biggest player. But they actually cooperate a lot better with the authorities than a lot of the other smaller sites. For example, in New Orleans and London, they focused on Airbnb, and all the activity, the illegal activity, has moved off to HomeAway and Booking, who then saw a huge increase in their revenues and stonewalled any attempts to cooperate after that.
Interesting. Are you able, Ruben, to share with us any case studies, perhaps, any buildings that you're working with or have been working with, and the results they've been able to achieve working with and using B&B Guard?
Sure. One of our first customers was actually Benlong Apartments. It's the one right next to the Opera House. Looks like a toaster.
Yeah, very famous.
They've been a customer of ours for almost since the beginning now, about 9 months. They had some problem with a potential host in their building who wants to put up these listings against on Airbnb against the bylaws of the building. And they do it in a sneaky way where they put it up just for a few days and then it disappears. And the reason they do that is because they know with such a high demand property, they can charge $2,000 or $3,000 a night for a booking over Christmas. And that's, if you get 2 or 3 weeks worth of that, which is easily done in a few days during peak time, you're making $20,000, $30,000. That's enough to pay for any of the fines or anything like that. We keep a really, really close eye on on those listings on that site, and we find this host that perennially tries to sneak them through. We find them and then send them to the building manager right away, who can then shut them down before they actually receive any bookings.
So is that an owner, did you say, or a tenant who is doing this?
That is an owner who's using a professional host.
Right,
company.
I understand.
Like a Made Comfy. It's kind of a luxury version of Made Comfy.
What do you think about the new South Wales legislation, which is intending to regulate this area for us here?
Yeah, as you said before, it's not as bad as Victoria. It could be worse. And on the face of it, it seems like it's quite a sensible thing to do. It means that as an investor, for example, if you want to rent out your entire place, you can't do that for more than 180 days in Sydney. Trouble is, those kinds of laws have been tried overseas and they're very hard to enforce. I think that's particularly true for stratas who are trying to prove this. You can pass, with the 75% vote, they can pass a bylaw banning short-term rentals, but only for investors. So only when the host is not there as their primary place of residence. But proving that is going to be quite difficult. And there's all kinds of loopholes that we've seen, especially in New York, which has similar laws, where you get sort of syndicates of hosts having tenants who are rotated between properties kind of thing, just to work around that principal place of residence requirement. And if the strata ever has to prove it, the OC they wear the burden of proof, not the host, for whom it'd be a lot cheaper. The same with the safety regs. Great idea, but how are you going to actually enforce it? There's no registration system. There's no license, anything like that, which is really common overseas. So it's going to be essentially unenforceable. And I think the OCs are going to have a hard time using those laws to actually shape the kind of communities that they want, even if they have that 75% majority to do so.
Yeah, I think you might be right there. And all the more important then for buildings to be aware of and able to access resources for, I guess, taking matters into their own hands so far as the law permits, and being creative about how do you identify that this is happening, how do you prove it. So we might have a bylaw that bans short-term letting. Let's go to the tribunal to enforce that and seek a penalty. But how do we gather that evidence? How do we connect the listing to the lot? And how do we change the culture in our building to send the message that this is just not acceptable? So we come back to that first stage approach that you're talking about, Ruben, really working with the buildings to arm them with the knowledge and the resources that they need to do that. That's
the key point. It's really about, we started this out as a technology business, but it's increasingly becoming almost a kind of a service, almost a people business, to help OCs navigate this space. And there's trouble with the laws is they ignored, New South Wales laws, they ignored a few simple things like making short-term rentals opt-in. So you need 75% majority to actually allow short-term rentals in the buildings. And they don't allow buildings to just make a stand and say, we're not having any of this stuff at all. We don't want it. Owner, occupier, investor, whatever. And those two small changes, I think, would really help the strata communities create the kind of communities that they want. And the problem is, once the activity gets embedded, especially in those popular areas like Sydney CBD, Bondi, Surrey Hills, and Woolloomooloo as well in Sydney are really popular. Once the activity gets embedded there, you attract those kind of unit owners. You're never going to get it out. And even if you got 60% of the building who doesn't want it, they're forced to live with it or forced to move out to a place or an area that they don't want to live, just so they can have a home for a neighborhood. Which
is really sad. Isn't it bizarre that for such a long time in New South Wales, we have been allowed to ban animals, but we can't ban, or at least under this legislation that's coming, we can't ban short-term rentals?
Yes. And it's
interesting.
I can't speak to why the laws are the way that they are. All I can say is that overseas, it's been the cities, not the states, which have taken the lead, and they've tended to come up with much more practical solutions because they understand the problems. And one of the issues I have with the New South Wales laws is that they do hamstring a bit the local government's response. So we deal with a lot of local councils, some New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, and they want to respond to their own problems. And short-term rentals affect Bondi very differently than they affect Parramatta or even affect Byron Bay. And the local councils should have more leeway to respond to their problems and try different things too, because this is not a mature industry, right? We don't know the long-term impacts that this is going to have on us on an area like Byron Bay or Bondi. So they should be allowed to try different things and experiment and see what works. And that's how we're going to figure out how to regulate this long-term.
Good points. What should our listeners do, Ruben, to get started with solving a short-term letting problem that they may have?
So long-term, you need good strata management, good building management, and technology like B&B Guard. Together, those give you the bylaws that you can enforce. They give you the official or unofficial policies to make life difficult for short-term rental guests and hosts, to undermine that economic case and push the activity out of the building. And then the technology, our goal is to just make that really cheap and easy so anyone can just plug it in and do it. And things like enforcing that investor short-term rental ban in New South Wales strata, that becomes a really cheap and easy thing to do. That's where we want to be, and that's where we want to play. In the short term, though, if you can't get your OC on side, if your OC is on side but your strata manager isn't cooperating, or you're worried about the legal bills and things like that, these are all natural things to be worried about. But there are things you can do to make life a bit harder for short-term rentals to, again, undermine that economic case. We've got customers who make short-term rental guests wait outside in the rain to reduce the reviews. We have customers who ask the cleaning companies, who the professionals use for public liability insurance every time they come in. Again, just to make life difficult, just to increase the costs. In New South Wales, there is a compelling legal argument that you can cancel swipe cards you believe are compromised.
Yep.
I would argue that any swipe card that's stored in a lockbox, that unit swipe card is then compromised, because, as I said, you can find out where those units are. You can find out where those buildings are very cheaply, and those lockboxes are not foolproof. And if all that is beyond the stomach of your OC or your strata manager or your building manager, and that's where a lot of it has to lie ultimately, there's always the ATO. And we've had a very good success rate with shutting down short-term rentals just by threatening to report the income to the ATO.
Interesting.
And we're building, the next version of our product will have a feature which will estimate that income over time. So we can tell the ATO if the place is up for 6 months, we can send a letter off to the ATO with a one click saying this listing at blah, unit X at this address has made $10,000 this year. Wouldn't you?
Yeah.
We've had very good success with that so far.
Good timing as well, I think, because I know that the ATO is very involved at the moment with data matching, whatever that is. You'll have a better technical head than mine, Ruben. But they are able to connect whatever data the ATO's got with what you have then reported as being your income for the year, and they are coming after those who have not reported that income. So I think they're on the warpath. So very good tip there, along with many other very practical tips for creative ways to deal with short-term letting. Short-term letting is something that we've discussed a few times on the podcast. All the way back in episode 4, we got some really practical tips as well from Karen Stiles of the OCN. So check out that episode if you haven't yet. And again, I had a chat about short-term letting in episode 7, where I specifically talked about how you can use bylaws to deal with short-term letting. So a few more practical tips in those episodes over at yourstrataproperty.com.au/podcasts. Ruben, everyone who is on the podcast gets the book question. What books have had the greatest impact on you and why?
I always struggle with this one a bit. I've come from quite a varied background, and I've done everything from write children's books for a living to do pretty detailed data analysis and things like that, and machine learning type stuff. I'd say off the top of my head, the book that I've read in the last few years which has had the biggest effect on me, there's two. One is called Managing the Grey. His author's name escapes me, but Managing in the Grey is about how to make hard decisions when you don't have all the information, and how to understand the consequences and live with those consequences, whether it's shutting down a factory or firing an employee or things like that. The other book that I found really valuable that I read recently was The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. It's a very good book, especially if you're involved in a business or a startup. It is very honest, a look at actually running a company and the decisions you have to make, and just full of useful information and tips.
Excellent. And Managing in the Grey, I have just been able to look up for you Joseph L. Badaracco, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. We will make sure there are links to those in our show notes, as well as links to bnbguard.com.au. And I'm just debating with myself here, Ruben, whether we include links to all of those smaller, not as well-known hosting sites. I'll have to think about that one. A few of them I had never heard of. So it's good that you guys have your finger on the the pulse there.
Thanks, Amanda.
Before we wrap up, Ruben, let us know how our listeners can find you, and if there's anything you want to add, jump in.
You can find us online. We're at bnbguard.com.au, or search for BNB Guard, letter B, letter N, letter B Guard. Or you can email me at ruben@bnbguard.com.au.
Excellent. We will all be watching closely to see what you do next. It sounds like you're doing some great work so far. And if you'd like to work with Ruben and B&B Guard, you absolutely know where to find him. Do reach out. Thanks so much, Ruben. I'm sure we'll have you back on the show perhaps sometime next year when our legislation in New South Wales has hit the ground, and perhaps assess the fallout from that and see if our predictions are in line or not.
I'd love to. Thanks very much, Amanda.
Thank you for listening to Your Strata Property, the podcast which consistently delivers to property owners reliable and accurate information about their strata property. You can access all the information below this episode via the show notes at www.yourstrataproperty.com.au. You can also ask questions in the comments section, which Amanda will answer in her upcoming episodes. How can Amanda help you today?